up to you guys in the second, so have those hands ready. But you mentioned so many things there. The one that just jumps out to me is just the dynamic of this family, and how beautifully you were able to bring that to the screen and kind of incorporate the greater country and then just the smaller
Right.
Chinatown community, and then we got down to that kind of nuclear family, and especially just the way the husband and wife just balanced each other out so perfectly. And I just was wondering if you had any other comments on that. It was just such a gift, I felt like, as a filmmaker, and just what you were able to bring to the screen, the husband and wife
Well,
dynamic.
it was a gift. I mean, we went into this film, I went into this film, we came in at the beginning of the trial, and I was hopeful, or hoping, I should say, maybe not hopeful, I was hoping that we would be able to be in the courtroom for the trial, and we found out very quickly that that wasn't going to happen. I was hoping we would have some kind of access to the prosecution and the defense teams during the trial. That didn't happen. So really we were quote unquote left with, and I mean that in quotes, we were left with sort of being with the family outside the courtroom as they went through the trial, and then we had to figure out other ways to dramatize the trial. But you know what? They are the heart of this movie, and I'm so thankful that they were so candid and open to let us in, knowing that the verdict could very well have gone against them. I mean, it came down to a 10-day deliberation, and even knowing that they couldn't control the outcome, of the trial or this film, they were willing to commit themselves to it, and I think it spoke to their character. It spoke to their belief in themselves and their innocence. And there are other ways in which they, again, they never claimed there was no fraud, and they never claimed that they needed to do some things to deal with the fraud. But they did not orchestrate or condone or encourage, in my view, and ultimately the jury's view, that fraud to happen. And everything about them spoke to that. I know that Polly Greenberg didn't think they were found innocent. She felt like they were just found not guilty, which is legally true. I mean, a lawyer will tell you that's true. They don't. The jury doesn't stand up and go, "We find the defendant innocent."
Right.
They say we find the defendant, guilty or not guilty.
Very good, very good. Well said. Questions from our friends here? Yep. Oh, microphones.
Just an astonishing movie. I want to know how you learned about the case, and how you decided that you would kind of bring all of your resources to at least beginning to kind of prepare yourself to make a movie without knowing, say, how the trial was going to come out and so forth.
Sure. I found out about the case not from the mainstream media, because it wasn't being covered. Even in New York City, the media capital of the world, it wasn't really being covered. The New York Times did, and you saw the article in the film, they did the indictment, that spectacle of the people chained together and Vance's announcement. They covered that, and then they covered the verdict, which is what Mr. Sung's reading at the end of the film. But in the 3 years in between, they didn't. There wasn't a single article in the New York Times about it, and nor any of the other mainstream press. Occasional article here and there, like in the business, periodicals or whatever of New York. But I heard about it through Mark Minton, one of the producers, who was friends with the Sung family going back 10 years. He had met Vera socially, and then just become friendly with them, and he heard about all this and was astounded by it, and then eventually came to me as the trial was imminent and said, I think there's a important film here to be done, and told me about it, and that led to me then going to New York for 3 or 4 days to film and sort of see what we captured and get a sense of the family and the story, a greater sense of it, and based on that I was hooked. I don't do a lot of preparation in the sense of research and all of that when I jump into most films. Some films require that, but most films I don't. I like the idea of sort of plunging into it and following the story where it leads you, because that's part of the great joy and excitement of doing documentary is that you don't go in with a clear you know, you have to have a good idea, I believe, and a good story that you want to follow, but you don't want to have it all figured out in advance, because what's the point of making it if you've got it all figured out?
And also, if you have it figured out, sometimes you'll miss.
You miss, yeah.
You're looking for the story that you've already decided is going to be told, and there's
Exactly.
there's this other story over here that you're not seeing.
Exactly.
What was your greatest challenge then, as you plunged into this, as you're trying to follow this story? What were some of the, would you say, some of the greatest obstacles?
I think the greatest challenge, single challenge, was how are we going to tell the story of the trial when we can't be in the courtroom and we don't have access to the legal teams during the trial. But we early on had this idea that we would get a courtroom artist to go in and spend a few days and do some illustrations that would become the backbone for, you know, much more elaborate illustrations done in the service of the story once the trial was completed and we waded through the 8,000 pages of transcript and decided which parts we were gonna dramatize. So, and then we did some reenactment. We got the defense lawyers to play themselves in the reenactment, which was a nice plus. But that's their voices. The other voices are all people, you know, pretending to be the prosecution or the witnesses. And so
the defense attorney went in a sound booth and did their kind
yeah,
of,
they were great.
which I thought those were great. That was great, and they could probably, okay, I remember.
I said, I gave them great direction. I said, you're a lawyer. And
just be yourself.
you know,
Just be.
play this like as if you were a lawyer. But yeah, I mean, they, you know, and the courtroom artist we got, Christine Cornell, just I think happens to be the best courtroom artist in New York City. I think her illustration is beautiful. We of course expanded the notion of what a courtroom illustration is because we had angles that she was able to create for us that you would never see in a real courtroom. You know, they have one position in the, you know, they're looking at the backs of lawyers' heads, and they're not around behind the witness booth looking into the face of the lawyers during questioning. We did more of a storyboard through her ultimately, but those days in court were really precious and valuable in terms of her really getting the sense of the space and the feeling of the trial so that she could then expand on that.
How tough was it to get Mr. Vance? Or was he
He was
game?
tough. No, he when we
I was
first
surprised to see him once. You know,
Yeah.
he really gave you. I mean, it wasn't a little quip here or there. He was.
he was. I
Best.
thought he was quite revealing.
Yeah.
They were. We had a really hard time getting anybody from the prosecution side for many months. I mean, all through the trial, we had no luck. We were trying. You know, it's such a huge office that there were a number of assistant DAs who had left the office who had had some connection to the investigation leading up to the trial because they started investigating Abacus in 2010. They indicted them in 2012, and it went to trial in 2015. So that's 5 years. But we got all these names for lawyers. We pursued them in private practice, and none of them were willing to speak to us. None of them. And really, the key became when Frontline got involved after the trial in the film. We were looking for funding, and we got funding from Frontline and ITVS, Independent Television Service of Public Television. And when Frontline got involved, we got a co-producer named Nick Verbitsky, who was just an absolute bulldog. He'd done a lot of financial cases on film, I mean, dealt with a lot of financial stories in New York, lives in New York. And he managed to get Polly Greenberg, the head of economic crime. She had since left the office after the trial. So she was the first get for us. And then he pursued all the jurors, because we knew after the fact that there had been this real, divide in the jury room. So we were determined to get at least one juror who was one of the holdouts and one that wasn't, which Nick managed to get. Check. And then we got Vance last. And I think having gotten the others, that helped. But I think a big key to it, too, was we were now with Frontline. And we weren't just independent filmmakers coming in trying to do this story. We were frontline, and with that came more respect for what we were doing, but it also came with that fear, I think, that you know, it's one thing to say no to independent filmmakers. It's another thing to say no to frontline, and you know, that show on public television is a very important show. A lot of opinion leaders watch that show. It gets attention. You know, in my mind, I imagine him, because he probably watches Frontline, I imagine him like fearing that guy that, what's his name, Will somebody, that narrates the Frontline. I imagined him going, Cyrus Vance Jr. declined to participate on multiple occasions. You know? And then he, you know,
Cut to footage of trying to call Cyrus Vance's
Exactly.
office,
Exactly.
and they're hanging up on
Yeah.
you. You know.
I imagine he didn't want that.
A couple more questions from our audience.